All right, so let's look at snapshot testing. So, we see that Jest is one of the things that we see that it can do is to automate, right? To be able to take as input a set of functions and then exercise those algorithms and compare whether the actual output matches some expected value, and then report on that, right? But that's not really what we're looking for. What we're looking for is to be able to exercise and use those kinds of capabilities, but applied to a front end, right? So one of the techniques that we can use is snapshot testing. So snapshot testing is going to allow us to accomplish one of the, well, actually a couple of the challenges that we mentioned earlier, right? Remember, there were basically three, right? One of them was we'd like to be able to isolate it from the need of using an actual browser, right? And that's what snapshots are going to do. And two, another one that the snapshot is going to allow us to do is what we want to be able to isolate it from the dependency of a human being interacting with this user interface, right? We want to be able to simulate that user generating all sorts of events, right, as they interact with the user interface. We'd like to be able to do those two things. There's a third one, which is isolating it from a remote server. We'll do that a little later, right? So let's first look at those two, right? Isolating it from a browser and isolating it from a human interface, right? So what snapshot testing does is that it can take as input a component or set of components, and then exercise it and render what that component would have rendered like if this were be running in an actual browser, right? And then it can take a snapshot of what the rendering looked like at some point, right? And typically you would choose what that particular snapshot is the expected snapshot of what your page should actually look like, right? So say you reach a particular maturity and confidence of what your page should look like, you know, the layout of the sidebar, of the headers and the footer and the main content with a couple of tables and whatnot, and a couple of articles in there, and you reach to a consensus that this is exactly what it should look like, right? Usually also based on some known input data, right? Maybe some hard-coded data that you feed your component, and you know how it would render, right? So you know your input, you know what the resulting output should be, and then you take a snapshot of that being your expected DOM content. Yes, and now you use that as a base snapshot that is now your expected snapshot. That any consecutive snapshot that might come over, that might be later, you want to compare against them, because it might be that you continue working on that page. Yes, you know, maybe you add more features or different layout or whatnot. You want to make sure that whatever updates you make, perhaps changing the algorithm, how you calculate the array or whatnot, or some snippet of your page, that you don't break what was the original layout, right? That for the same input content, for the same input data, that it still renders as expected. Yes, that you want to make sure you don't introduce any defects. So here you have the component changes. So as you develop and you introduce new features and you fix things and you update things, the task can then generate multiple versions of the actual snapshots, right? As you iterate in your development effort, and then compare every single new snapshot with the expected snapshot, and report to you if somehow they're different, right? That for the same input, you're getting a different output, that it's rendering differently, right? And you want to be notified because it could be a potential defect, that somehow whatever you were working on, introduced some layout that was not expected. Make sense? Jest allows us to do that. Right. So let's now. So to accomplish this snapshot testing mechanism, we're going to use an additional library. We need to be able to replace the browser right? And be able to render the DOM that a browser would have rendered, okay, without an actual browser. Right? And there's quite a few, several libraries that allow you to do this. One of them is the React Test Renderer, right? The React Test Renderer. So we're going to install that. This is going to be added as a dependency to your project. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to try this out, right? To try our renderer, we're going to implement a trivial React component just to see this working, right? So here's our trivial React component, right? It's a link. It's a hyperlink, right? It's just a very simple hyperlink, but it's a hyperlink that has some behavior, right? That changes its layout slightly, very minutely, based on different behavior of the mouse, right? If the mouse hovers over the hyperlink, it changes its style a little bit, and when it leaves, it changes again, right? So what this is going to allow us to do is twofold. One of them is can we replace the browser, and the other one, can we simulate the interactions that an actual human being might have with the user interface. So two things, right? Can we replace the browser, and can we simulate a human being? So here's the hyperlink. We're establishing that a map where we're going to keep track of whether we are hovering over the hyperlink or we're not hovering over the hyperlink. And if we hover the hyperlink, we're going to change its class to hovered. If it doesn't hover over the hyperlink, if the mouse leaves, it's going to change it back to normal. Yes? Right, very simple. And we initialize the constructor, super, and we initialize the class, a state variable called class, and it's going to start as normal, right? And then we're going to toggle it between normal, hovered, as the mouse goes above it, it enters the hyperlink and leaves the hyperlink. Okay. All right. So here's the event handlers that are going to handle the mouse over and the mouse leave. As it enters the hyperlink and then when it leaves, right? When those events are going to invoke these two functions here. When you hover over the hyperlink, it's going to call this function onMouseEnter, and the only thing it's going to do is that it's going to change the state. Right? It's going to change class from normal to hovered. Right? When the mouse leaves, it's going to toggle the class state variable from hovered back to normal. Make sense? Right? But notice that it initializes with the state of normal. Okay. All right. Excellent. So here's our actual content that is being rendered. It's just a simple hyperlink with the two event handlers here. The two event handlers here, onMouseEnter and onMouseLeave, which are going to invoke those two functions that we declared earlier, which are basically going to do what? They're going to toggle the state between normal, hovered, normal, hovered. Yes? And notice here that we're using that state to populate our class name. So it's equal to, the class name will either be hovered or normal, as we enter or exit the hyperlink. Also, the page, the actual href will be pointing to something that we invoke from outside as an argument, or as a property or an attribute to our anchor. So up to this point, it's just plain all React. Right? There's nothing spectacular about it. It's just plain all React. So what I'd like to be able to do is test this link. Is it working? What I'd like to be able to do is, when it first renders, this is going to render how? It's going to render with class name equal normal. Yes? Because that's the initial state, correct? Is this rendering whatever we pass as an argument? And as the mouse goes in, this is going to change to hover. We want to check that if that's working. And then when it leaves, we want to check that this indeed changes back to normal. So let's do that. The way we're going to do this is that just like this file is called mylink.js, we're going to create another file, again, that ends with .test.js. It has the same name as the file under test, right? But it adds the .test as it's a naming convention, right? So that we know that this is a component and there's a test that goes along with it, right? And that's typically a good practice. Every component that you create, there should be a test that goes along with it, okay? That exercises that component, all its behaviors, right? That if you click on plus, right, it adds a new record, right? If you remove it, it actually removes it. If you update a record, it actually updates it, right? Here, we're just doing two trivial updates, right? We're hovering over it and we are leaving. All right, so to test this, what this is going to do is that this test, when we run this test, right, what it's going to do is that it's going to check to see if it has any snapshots. Are there any snapshots? The very first time that you run this test, there are no snapshots. Snapshots are going to be files. They're going to be just a file that's going to have the content of that file are going to be various layouts of the component, right? As it responds to multiple inputs, right? Various states of your component, based on different stimuli that you create on that component. So in particular, this particular link has 3 states. The first one, where class name is normal when it first renders, that's the first state. Then, as you move your mouse over, right, it's going to change to a different state. So it will have a different rendering, right? Where now the class name will have changed to hovered, yes? And when you move the mouse out, it'll change back to the original state where the class name goes back to normal. We need to be able to check for those 3 things, right? That it first loads one way, that it then changes to something else, and then it changes to something different based on 2 different events. Make sense? So there are 3 snapshots. 3 different versions of this same DOM element. Okay? All right? So and that is going to be stored in a file that's going to look like this. A file is going to be called like this. My link that is going to have the same name as a test, but it's going to have a snap at the end. See that? Right? And the standard the configuration is that they are stored by default under the source directory under a directory called __snapshots _ / the name of the test that generated this snapshot. Right? And internally, it's going to have the different versions of your DOM, right, as it changes from one rendering to another based on different inputs. Make sense? Right? At first, this file doesn't exist. Right? It's not there, right, because the test has never been run. All right? So when the test first runs, right, when the test first runs, right, what it does is the following. Right? Here's our test. Right? Notice that we've loaded our element, our component under test. There it is. And this is going to be our renderer. This is what's going to replace our browser. The browser is not going to play any role here. We're never going to see our actual link actually render on a browser. Well, I mean, you could, right? You could put the link in an actual app and run it and React npm start and see it rendered. Obviously, yes. But the whole intent here is to not use the browser. Right? Instead, we're going to use the React test render to replace the browser and do all the things that the browser would have done. Okay? So here's our test. Our test says the link changes the class when hovered. So here we're going to use the render in the React test render to create a rendering of the following elements. Here's our elements. Here's my link. Here's our property that we're passing along. Okay, and what's going to be using as the label of the link, and then we close the link right here. So notice that this is basically taking that and it's going to generate a DOM element out of this. Make sense? Right? So since this is going to be the very first time that this renders, right? It's gonna write to that file if it doesn't exist. It'll create the file. It'll render my link, like this. It renders it and says, okay, well, there it is. Notice that it puts a number at the end over here. Puts a number in here, right? That so that it knows, to what, what this particular version of the DOM, to which test does it belong to, right? And it renders like this. So here there's class name normal because the state was normal at the very beginning. The Facebook that was there, click me and whatnot. Notice the on mouse enter and the on mouse leave were just replaced with placeholders for the functions. We don't actually have the functions in there. We only want the DOM that gets generated. All right, so that's what gets generated the very first time. The next time around, I'm sorry, if you continue, it's gonna keep going. It's with the component that we instantiated. That's the component right here. This component, we're gonna use it, right, to now exercise it, right, and generate functions to it, right, or extract what the text, what the DOM representation was, and we would like to be able to compare it against what it used to be, any expected values. Obviously, we don't have an expected value. This one snapshot that we're generating right now, by default, will become our expected DOM, right? By default, the very latest snapshot will be the expected DOM. So that when we run this later on, and we generate another DOM, it'll be compared against the previous snapshot, right? If for some reason the new snapshot doesn't match the previous snapshot, it'll be reported as a potential defect, that something might have gone wrong. It rendered this way, presumably it's the correct way of rendering, right? And I'm just going to report whether something is amiss. Make sense? Right? So this is going to be we have our component. We can convert it into a JSON representation, and then we can feed that into our expect function. And we're going to say, does this match the snapshot? At the beginning, there was no snapshot, right? So there won't be any comparison. It won't report anything because there was nothing there. Instead, it will write it as the very first snapshot, right? So that the very first time, it won't report any differences because the whole thing is different. Right? It hasn't been a snapshot up to this point. We then can simulate various events. In this case, we can simulate the mouse enter event, and then generate what the resulting DOM would be, having generated that event, and then compare it against a snapshot that would be for this particular event, right? Now, obviously, the very first time there is no snapshot, so it won't report anything. It'll write into it. It will write into the file what the actual output was, so that next time around, when you rerun this test, it'll compare this new snapshot with the old snapshot, right, and report any discrepancies. Here we're doing the same thing with on-mouse leave. Generate the output, compare it. In this case, there's nothing to compare. We write it to the file, so that when you run it next time, right, it'll do all these comparisons and report any discrepancies. Right, so, and this is the snapshot with normal, the very first state, then the second state, having hovered on top of it. Notice that the class name has switched over to hovered, right? And then when we move the mouse when the mouse left, it went back to normal. See that? Right. So we want to be able to compare any changes in these files. So again, so this feature of this, using this library of React Test Render, allows us to replace the browser, and allows us to also replace the user to programmatically generate all these events.